And let me start. Yeah, I think we're good. I think everybody's in.
Okay, right on. Aloha mai kākou. Thank you everybody for coming, and especially mahalo nui to our esteemed panelists today for taking some time to have this really awesome discussion and timely discussion as well. My name is Ilima Long. I live in Mo'iliili on Oahu. I've worked in Hawaiian education primarily at UH Manoa through Native Hawaiian Student Services for 10 years until I left about 18 months ago to go work for the Teachers Union. My daughter attends Ke Kula Kaiapuni o Anuenue, and these are some of my personal stakes in the growth and success and takeover of Hawaiian education, just to situate myself as the moderator tonight a little bit. We're going to get to introducing our panelists in just a minute, but to situate this talk a little bit, first of all, welcome to this year's La Hoʻihoʻi Ea Hōʻike Ea, which is the annual gathering that happens in July in the spirit of La Hoʻihoʻi Ea to discuss questions around Hawaiian education. We're so happy that this year in both Honolulu and Pauilo and perhaps other places in the Pai'aina as well, that many of us will be regathering in person again this year, next Saturday, and on the La Nui itself on Sunday the 31st. It's been two very discombobulating couple of years. These 2 years have been a period of reflection for a lot of us. It's been 2 years of shining new lights, both on our community's strengths and on systemic problems, including in the realm of public education. And we've been given some time to reassess things. And this includes those who give their lives to the project of Hawaiian education. So while this particular discussion is online, what a better way to come back together around questions of education in the Lahui than to take an overall assessment of the state of Hawaiian education. And when I say Hawaiian education, I'm using it broadly to talk about the larger project of the Lahui and others to reclaim Ike Kupuna and ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi and Ike Hawaiʻi in education realms. So just to give a little snapshot, as part and parcel of the Hawaiian Renaissance and the explosive decade reigniting Hawaiian activism to reclaim our lands, rights, and culture in the late 70s and 80s, Kanaka fought also to reclaim space in the public education system. In 1980, a Hawaiian studies program was started in the DOE, made up of the Kupuna program for K through 6, and for secondary, Hawaiian history, once in 7th grade and once in 9th grade. Hawaiian immersion in the DOE was established in 1986, and today we have 21 kula kaiapuni, I believe, a small minority of which are K through 12. We have 6 Hawaiian language immersion charter schools, the majority of which are K through 12. Aina-based education programs have blossomed in some English medium schools, and the Hawaiian history classes that I mentioned just now have had a curricular revamp to bring them up to speed to sort of today's scholarly, Oiwi scholarly takes on Hawaiian history. We all saw the news stories amidst the standoff on Mauna Kea about increased interest in Hawaiian immersion and in higher ed and Hawaiian studies courses. And our right to access Hawaiian immersion education was reified recently in the Clarabelle case. Anecdotally, some of my own family is looking to relocate in Hilo, but both immersion schools have waiting lists for kindergarten, Papa Mala'o. Another friend wants her keiki to attend Anuenue in Palolo, and there is also a waiting list. So this shows sort of the demand that is there, right? Amidst this, we are also knee-deep in a teacher shortage crisis. And that is what it's referred to, a teacher shortage crisis. This is across the board in the Department of Education, where Native Hawaiians are the highest ethnicity percentage-wise. And for those keiki who are in immersion, there is a serious teacher shortage there as well. So this is a small glimpse of the landscape right now, and we're so fortunate to have 4 powerhouse Hawaiian education educators to help us unpack where we're currently at with Hawaiian education. So where are we, gang? Where do we need to go? Is there anything that we need to rethink or do more to recenter in our work to forward reclaiming this space that is so critical to any collective aspirations that we have around ea and sovereignty? So to start things off, we're going to do an icebreaker intro. And then after that, each panelist will pose a question to their fellow panelists. We'll open each question up for about 10 to 15 minutes of discussion and then move on to the next panelist and their question. And some of you may have witnessed it, but just so you know, we had a discussion amongst the panelists and decided the order through that. Okay, so to get things started, for the icebreaker, can each of you start by introducing yourselves, situate yourself in the project of Hawaiian education? And the icebreaker question is, why in your life's work in Hawaiian education did you choose to give it primarily in the public education realm? That'll just be to start us off, and we'll go in the order of the questions that are going to be posed. So if you can start by introducing yourself, Kaleikoa, please. Thank you.
Okay, aloha mai, o wau nei o Kaleikoa Kaʻeo, he ke papa no ka mokopuni o Maui. Hana ia ma ke mokopuni nei. Upuka mai ke kula kiʻekiʻe o Baldwin, maroon and blue, aloha nui. Hele no ke kula nui o Hawaiʻi ma Manoa. Ma leila no kumoai ma ka na mahele o Hawaiʻi, me ka ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi no hoi. Mahaupe, wa komo no hoi ma ka polokalamu o ke kālai aina. Ma i manawa, hoi no, i ke ia mokopuni nei o Maui, ke noho nei, maua o kahele me ka maua mau keiki e kolu, ma waiahuli, aina ho pula pula ma Maui nei, no leila. Aloha, Belina me ke aloha. Shall I forget the main, sorry. Oh yeah, public education, well, as someone who has born and raised in public education, I consider myself a, maka'ainana from the land. And I've always saw my role as a so-called educator, as a, whether it's community or ohana or, the people of the land. And so I kind of fancy myself in many ways as a champion, maybe, for those of us who had never been privileged in many ways to have received support from some of those famous institutions. In fact, I would say I never got 10 cents from some of those institutions. And like the majority, in fact, the vast majority of our people will not have a so-called private education. And so for me, I'm a big believer if this so-called nation of our Lahui Kanaka is or will regain our rights and to self-determination and control of our destiny, of our lives, it's really going to come from the masses of people, and the masses of people are in public education. And therefore, we don't rise from the top, but we rise from below, as the great ʻŌlelo no ʻeau says, ia liʻi no ke aliʻi ke kanaka. Ia liʻi no ke aliʻi ke kanaka. An aliʻi becomes a liʻi because of the people. Yeah, so it's not so much this whole mentality of a leadership that must be developed. As for me, it's really about service from the bottom up. And so when I think of public education, it's really about reteaching our people our kuleana, so that we can take direct control of our lives. And so, public education for me, again, that's where the masses of our people are. And if there are going to be positive changes to our people, it's going to take the movement of the masses. So, mahalo.
Thank you. Hiapo.
Ina kanaka nui, amena kanaka nui, amena kanaka nui o ka aina. Ano ko me he kanaka, ina he kanaka nui. A he kanaka iki I waino o kako, he kanaka nui. Nā mea apau e awa moana I keola. Keola o ko kako kanaka ana. Mahea la ke la I ke ia maula. Ina ai ke awa moala. Kanaka nui no. Ke a aku nei I ke aloha piha plena ole I mua o ko apau. Ke ia hui ana o kako I ke ia alu nahi ahi. No u piha ka hano o ke noi ia e unoho pū me ke ia mau lae ula ahi kanana o ka la hui. Ka mea hoʻi e waile nei ke ala I mua o kākou e ao kanaka ai e pili ana I ko kākou kanaka ana. Ke haawea aku nei I ke aloha nui ia o kua pau o wau o Hiapo. And although I physically reside in a certain geographical location and have been working there, I have been for the past 32 years. I've dedicated my entire working life and educational life to the ʻŌlelo Hawaii. And it just so happens that it's physically in Hilo, but first and foremost in my heart, in my mind, and in my soul, it was for ʻŌlelo Hawaii. Still is ʻŌlelo Hawaii until the day that I no longer can do it and beyond. Taking off from where Kaleikoa said, one of the things that I would like to point out is that being here with friends talking about Hawaiian education today, you know, we are probably the last generation of those who enjoyed Mana Leo Piha. Right here, these people right here. And so when I think back in 32 years, and when I think back of having 15 concentrated years with all of those old folks from Ni'ihau, and how they gave so selflessly, excuse me, and how they, yeah, not selfishly, selfishly maybe because, you know, you gotta go school, you gotta, selflessly, who am I? Who am I to hold that to myself? And who am I to say over here, over there, Alahui ʻŌlelo Hawaii is Alahui ʻŌlelo Hawaii because a Kanaka ʻŌlelo Hawaii. And a Kanaka ʻŌlelo Hawaii cannot be a Kanaka ʻŌlelo Hawaii without hoʻona'auao. Kiko pau. Ho'ona'auao, we can talk all day about what that means and what that looks like and whatever. If we take a look at basically what it was in the kingdom, everything was managed and expressed through our ʻŌlelo Kanaka. And so if that's that has been a goal of mine to work together with whomever, everyone, every single one, to get to realize that Lahui ʻŌlelo Hawaii. It all starts with a Kanaka ʻŌlelo Hawaii. So to work together to build Kanaka, ahe Kanaka, so that the Lahui ʻŌlelo Hawaii, it is because of the Kanaka. I'm very honored and humbled to have been invited this evening, and I thank you very much, Ilima, and dear friends, Kalehua folks and Kaleikoa folks, Kahele, aloha nui loa. O kua pau, ke ia hui ana o kākou ke ia aluna hiahi. Aloha nui kākou.
Mahalo nui. Kalehua.
Aloha mai. Kala'i o lualua lei nei e haawi aku ai ku'u aloha. He wai puna lau ke ia e nā makamaka ma ke e nei I ka pono Hawaii. Aloha nui. E ʻŌlelo wana wau e ka pili aku wau he mana'o malalo mai e ka ko'o ai I ka ʻŌlelo nani loa ko'u keikua ana o Hiapo. Ano ke kanaka iki. Ano ka mea o wau nei no kela e ake nei I ka haiki ana o ko'u ala. No kela ano koʻikoʻi o ka ike, koʻikoʻi o ke kulana o ke kanaka, koʻikoʻi o ka hua o kela ano na'auao ana. Ano lila, ano nā kanaka nui a me nā kanaka iki, aloha nui kākou. You know, realistically going into, I want to just say ditto to what Kaleikoa said, and then kind of leave it right there because that's basically, you know, our people walked through a process, and it was intentional, I'll say. And it was a process that, you know, many call oppression, colonization, occupation, and whatever the term is that we label it as, it was rough and it was difficult. And so when our people walk through that process, I would say, because, you know, Kale, I actually had a few years in private education, and I don't actually think that that's where our children should be either, you know, and I'll put that out publicly. I mean, everyone's trying their best. But in the midst of the trauma and tragedy that our people walk through, that there are ideological shifts that got to take place. And there's no better place to have that happen than public education, where our people are at, you know. And so for myself, it's always been about trying to build bridges, look at, try to pragmatically look at how to move a large collective to a better place through education. And so for myself, the only thing I can see right now is public education. So as part of that introduction, you know, I became a teacher to teach in immersion schools, the Kaipuni schools. And then I became a teacher educator at UH Manoa, the College of Education. Took on a role as a test developer, and then worked in the Office of Hawaiian Education. Now landed here as a principal in Nanakuli of Kawai Hono Kana'awa Public Charter School, which is not an immersion school yet. But that's where the construct has taken me. So that's my introduction. Mahalo.
Yes, and last but not least, she who relentlessly fights for Hawaiian education and the structure of public ed, Kahele.
Velina nui a kakoa pau e nā kupa o ka aina. Nui ko'u mahalo, ia o ka apau i ka hui ana o kako i keia pō. Ma'anei no ka walao ana i keia mea nui a ko'i. Aloha nui, everybody. And I think about why I'm in public education. I grew up in a really large family, and you know, looking back upon my experience growing up, I think my parents, knowingly or unknowingly, really nurtured this class consciousness in us. Right? It was always about no, think you better than anybody. Take care of everybody. You know, my parents were like, we had 8 kids, but if you were there on the day that we bought shoes for school, everybody got shoes. You know, you feed everybody, you clothe everybody. That's just something that I grew up with. And then I was raised in public education, and I kind of fell into immersion teaching, right? I went to college as an art major because I didn't really have a clue what I wanted to do. But I found Hawaiian language and I found Hawaiian studies. And then immersion found me. And I started to teach at Paia Elementary here on Maui. And I taught in immersion for about, I think, 8 or 9 years before I moved to UH Maui College. But we have 3 kids who went through Punana to, you know, graduating high school in Kaiapuni. And, you know, we've been involved since, you know, our college days in Hawaiian education. And the more I learn about, so I've always had this, like, it's in my na'au, right? Public education. And my experiences and my, you know, formal education has just taught me that why I think it has been stuck into my when we think about the history of public education in Hawaii, and the more I've learned about the history of public education in Hawaii during the kingdom period, how we used it, how we embraced Western education, and all of that, all that entails, and then how, you know, it was used against us to assimilate us. It was used by America. And the place we are at now, in my mind, that kuleana was begun by us, and it should be, and it should be reclaimed by us, right? And we should not, I mean, like Kaleikoa and people said, most of Hawaiian students are in the public schools, but that system was developed using our resources, right? So we shouldn't have to go outside and build our own school and ask for more. I mean, these are our resources to have. And because all of our students are there, and because in my mind and in my heart, in my na'au, when I look at this system and I walk down the DOE, you know, when I walk through that office, the first person you see on that wall is David Malo, right? And you can see the political trajectory of public education in Hawaii, and it goes exactly along Hawaiian, Haole, Kepani to this day. So I think it's a tool that we have to engage, and that we have always engaged, I think. But there's way more of us now today to really impact that institution so that we can have that engagement with not just our Hawaiian students, especially our Hawaiian students, but with all students in Hawaii. Mahalo.
Mahalo, that was awesome. Yes, AO. I just want to shout out to all of our participants. I just looked at the list and I see a whole bunch of students, aspiring educators, new educators trying to make it in those first couple of years as a teacher. Oh my gosh. Yeah, stay. And some really established longtime educators. So mahalo everybody for your work and for being here. Okay, so format. Kaleikoa is gonna kick it off with the first question. I am mostly here just to keep time. I would ask that sort of like self-manage the discussion, and that everybody definitely step up and spend some time, you know, engaging in the question that is posed by your fellow panelists. And really excited to get this going. So why don't you take it away, Kaleikoa?
Okay. Well, you know, a lot of times we discuss, of course, you know, what is Hawaiian education? And I'm one of those who, instead of looking at it kind of a hermeneutics process, but, you know, again, what is getting to the question of what is the purpose of Hawaiian education for me is always the bigger question. And so to get to that question, I just like to ask everyone if you can kind of maybe discuss or share your ideas on whether or not there is a difference, or what would the difference be, or similarities on these two statements. Is there a difference between being Hawaiian educated and an educated Hawaiian? You know, being Hawaiian educated and an educated Hawaiian, and therefore just to kind of move us into that kind of a discussion. So I don't know who's going to be first, but
Kaleikoa, I'm going to intervene with a little follow-up question. Kimo Cashman's asking for clarification. You mean Hawaiian as ethnicity or nationality?
that's actually, that's part of the discussion. That's part of, I think, the discussion, Hawaiian educated and educated Hawaiian. So.
Okay. Jacketable, I'll just jump in. I really like that question. For myself, if it's okay, I'm gonna define Hawaiian as an ideology. And so because that's where I carry it. That the current educational system, you know, at the 30,000 foot level for me has only done two things, because everything, and I'll just preface that from here on out, my philosophy of education is about centering it on Aina and the ecology. And so because of that, I think that in looking at recounting what Ilima was kind of sharing about what transpired in education, that the educational system, it looks like from the 30,000 foot level, has prepared our children to either use land for human consumption, or it's taught them, it hasn't taught our children, us, how to malama Aina. And so between that, those two pathways, I'm gonna say that an educated Hawaiian, ideologically speaking, is gonna be somebody that understands the ecology, understands the implications of our behaviors and actions on the environment. And it's really it's gonna walk through the understanding that if you are looking for these quote unquote best practices, that many times as educators, we walk through trainings and facilitated meetings to better understand what the best practices are, is that the genealogy of those best practices are always centered on human beings. And so ideologically speaking, if our trajectory is going to take us to a place of someone who's educated ideologically as a Hawaiian, that not every decision that comes out of anything of our school systems, of our government systems, anyone participating as a product of the public school system, none of those things are going to, that the ideology of that Hawaiian is going to be someone who cares for the land, not just through words, but through actions, through lifestyles, behaviors, and then ultimately in the systems that represent us, decision-making and funding. And so I hope I'm not punting the question. I think for myself that the argument of ethnicity or nationality is not the correct one. I think Hawaiian, ideologically speaking, and I know where are we going to find that and how we're going to essentialize that. I'm going to share that what I believe in is that our kupuna are the master expert researchers of our geographic area representing the species of humanity, and that the culture that they derived were the accumulation of best practices on how to live in this place and care for this place and interact with each other. And they put a lot of effort just by looking at the repository of writing that our ancestors left for us in our ʻŌlelo, that they wanted us to know things about them. And I carry that they wanted us to know things about them so that their ways and their beliefs and their practices would be available for us as best practices to continue in perpetuity, not just as a species, but the entire ecology of Hawaii. So I'll stop there.
In addition to that, in my little cubbyhole of the universe, you know, my students come in my class and I tell them, I really don't care about your na'au. And, you know, they kind of freak out because, you know, na'au equals Hawaiian, right? People equate na'au and Hawaiian. And I tell them straight off, I really don't care about your na'au. You know, we have 114 years of our kupuna writing all of these histories, all of these genres of writing that they put down, right? Let's use that as a starting point to educate ourselves into what that is. Instead of sitting around and romantically just making stuff up just because you're feeling it and you feel it and you feel it. What about this literacy? And when I'm talking about literacy, I'm not talking about the ability to read and write. When I talk about literacy, I'm talking about having this strong working knowledge of constitution of thought, constitution of language, and constitution of content, traditional knowledge. And then with all of that literacy, then we move forward responsibly in creating anew, because that's the cycle, right? The cycle of Hawaiian education. You don't learn all of these things just to be smart and sit on the side. You learn all of these things to then reproduce, but you have to reproduce in a certain way, right? And that's where the na'au, that's where the na'au comes in. But you know, na'au minus the literacy is just romanticism run amok, and we don't need any more of that, right? So in honor of Kaleikoa's massive question, to me, whatever it looks like, to me, I strive to work to growing the perspective of a Hawaiian literacy in anybody who will listen, and then give them as much as we can to support their growth in Hawaiian literacy, so that generation after generation after generation, the literacy becomes who we are, right? Not just the 114 years on paper, or all of these ethnological reports, all of these oral histories. They're all important, but if we don't use them to inform our perspective, then what is the expression, right? What is the verbal expression? What is the body expression? What is the spiritual expression? It's spooky to think that romanticism rules, and we gotta stop that. We gotta stop that. So in honor of that question, I say we stop that romanticism and we start walking harder on literacy, Hawaiian literacy. Aloha nui.
Okay. Eo, Hiapo, ame Kalehua. Yeah, I mean, to me, there's a, but whether we talking about, well, let's just say we're talking about Hawaiian ideology. Let's put it that way, right? Absolutely, there's a difference. When you think about the education that took place between 1893 and 1980 in the public education system, we had a lot of educated Hawaiians. A lot of educated Hawaiians, right? A lot of Hawaiians went through that public education system, and they were educated, but they knew nothing about themselves. They do nothing about their history. They knew nothing about their language, right? That's assimilation. That's how education is used. Education is never neutral, right? It is working towards something. It's working towards something. And it took us fighting throughout that time, right? Sometimes we think that, it was this whole blank, everybody forgot, and then we woke up, late 1970s. That's not really the truth when you look at the education, or you look at policy, or you look at the legislature, right? There are Hawaiians in there the whole time trying to reclaim pieces of that kuleana of education throughout those years of the territory and state. So lots of educated Hawaiians, zero identity, zero connection promoted by their schooling to their Hawaiianness, and an intentionally also not teaching them certain things, right? History, language, even their political history. When I talk about somebody who's Hawaiian educated, I'm thinking of somebody who has na'awao, right? As Hiapo was talking about, who is learning their history, language, culture, and not just learning it, but using it to engage in our society today to better our people. So I think there's a huge difference between those things. And I think if people are educated, but only look at, so when you look at what is the purpose of education, if it's not, about lahui and whether, feeding, housing, aina, regaining control so that we can make our own decisions, whether it's education, whatever it is, then, poho is my mana'o. Honestly, poho, because you're not neutral. You're working for the other hat. You're working for the other side, right? If you think you're neutral because you're not working on being Hawaiian educated, that's bullshit, right? You just gave up, right? And you're working for the other side. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Kaleikoa, you want to either respond to anybody or just?
Yeah, I'm just going to add kind of, let me tell a little story. One of the things when back in the old days when actually Dr. Keanu Sai and I used to be hired by the University of Hawaii to go out and recruit Hawaiians to higher education. And so we'd go into all of the schools and talk. And one of the questions I would always start my talks with, and I always give this example. I was actually Kalani Makekau Whitaker and I went up to Whitman College, kind of fancy 4-year college in Washington, East Washington. Anyway, we go up to this fancy college and we meet up with the Hawaii and Pacific students, and we did a talk in beautiful theater. I go up on stage and I always ask, the first question I ask, of course, is, who discovered Hawaii? And out from the middle, and this is probably in the mid 90s. So this is, 25 plus years ago. And, in the middle of the pack, tall, good looking Hawaiian guy stands up and yells out, Captain Cook, 1778. And I said, what school you graduated from? He said, Kapalama, Kamehameha schools. And I tell this because obviously he's a very intelligent Hawaiian. For him to have gotten into that school, he was intelligent. But my point is, being intelligent and so-called being educated is not one and the same thing. And it started me to think about this idea, what it means to be educated. And so that idea, what is it to be an educated Hawaiian? Many people, our people would look at that young Hawaiian man and say, wow, that's an educated Hawaiian. For him to have gotten into that school, high SAT scores, did whatever was necessary to get into this top school. And yet, in my eyes, of course, he failed miserably in that not recognizing this idea that somehow our people, like the rocks and trees, what were waiting to be discovered in 1778, that somehow we were not a people before that. And to me, that's a very important understanding in regards to the difference sometimes in being called educated. Again, I don't got all the answers. I'm not trying to define everything perfectly, but I want us to really think about what we are doing in regards to educating Hawaiians today. You know, so much of our students, whether in private or public schools, are moving towards this path of being educated. But what is that so-called education? And so it started me to think about education, especially during the so-called period after our overthrow. So one of the things I always talk about, we got to recognize, especially with the question of language, right? We always talk about 1895 and the language being banned. But the language was banned, not because the language was ugly or, you know, the language was something, that wasn't the goal. The goal wasn't to ban the language. Banning the language was part of the process to rob ourselves of a way of thinking as Kanaka. Why did they want to rob us from thinking as Kanaka? So that we'll become complicit in our own so-called subjugation. So we become complicit in our own so-called mental colonization. So we start to look at ourselves not as people that were here for 2,000 years, but people that started to become human after the coming of Captain Cook. And so education was the means, and I'm going to use the word education because, again, and I would probably use the word miseducation was the means by which our people were transformed from a people in the Hawaiian kingdom that were very subjective in our so-called education. I think Kimo's question, see, oh, that's where it comes into. If you think about, especially the Hawaiian kingdom period, we're very subjective, very controlled in regards to what we wanted to learn for the purposes to serve our needs. With the process of miseducation, right, the whole purpose was to take out from our minds any sense that would hold our identity, which of course language really is the, you know, that's the main, you know, that's the coding to really understand this knowledge that's been handed to us for many generations. And so when I think about even the word na'awao, and I think about when we use the word to imi na'awao, what are we saying? What is this imi na'awao that's going on? What is this na'awao that we talk about today? And so when I think about being Hawaiian educated, that's where I want us to start to turn, really start to look at what that means instead of thinking of ourselves as becoming so-called educated. Because another kind of thing I kind of thought about was, especially this idea of miseducation. I remember trying to think about the word like to teach a horse, right? When you're going to train a horse. And I remember I was thinking like, is that a'o? Do you a'o I kalio? You know, I'm trying to think like, what is this word to teach a horse? And I remember listening to Ka'alakea on a tape once. And of course, the word train, of course, ho'olaka. And I think, wow, ho'olaka. And then I started to think about ho'olaka being really the word that should be used when you talk about our people's so-called miseducation. And again, as Kylie just said, you know, there's no such thing as neutral education. Education is part of building the so-called hegemony, the ways in which they control our minds. Because what is hegemony? So that we as Kanaka become complicit in our so-called own subjugation. We don't even question the subjugation. We start to believe, in fact, that their goals, their history, their heroes, their songs, their alma maters, their ideas of what is good, so-called SATs, that's the path of salvation. When in reality, all we are doing, of course, is further entrenching ourselves in a process of defilumizing ourselves from who we are to serve the interests of becoming complicit. And so we end up with many hundreds, if not thousands of our young Hawaiians, like the one that I met at that school. And so we need to kind of start to, I think, talk about this in this way. We talk about that period, especially the period after 1895, especially talking about the DOE period. And I would question what exactly going in, what's happening with the majority of our kids right now and students who are in public education right now. What is the process of whole? And see, that's why, and I think when we use our own language, you see, it comes very clear. It is ho'olaka that's going on. It is a way of trying to train our young to adapt, to assimilate, to coercive assimilation, to become complicit, and to somehow buy in to the idea that the measurement of what can be considered educated has to somehow meet the standards of somebody in Iowa, instead of for our own selves, determining for our own selves what this goes on. So that's why I always go back to that question of not what is Hawaiian education, but what is the purpose of Hawaiian education? I would suggest that today, the purpose of Hawaiian education today is to relieve ourselves of that ho'olaka and to navigate in a trajectory. I don't have all the answers, but I think all of us and different peoples have the answers to get them. But the trajectory, of course, is to reverse the ho'olaka and to find true ho'ona'auao. So.
Awesome, you guys. So good. We're going to keep moving so that we can hopefully get to some questions at the end. But this is such a rich discussion already. And there's my alarm. All right. So Hiapo, please share with your panelists your question and with the audience.
Mahalo. So in keeping with Kaleikoa's ho'olaka, you know, what Kahele was talking about as well, intentional erasure, right? In relation to the dated notion of language and culture, right? Language and culture. Can Hawaiian education be more than what this dichotomy represents, which is truly the separation of language, which is ʻŌlelo Hawaii, and culture, which is ʻŌlelo Hawaii ole. Okay. Can Hawaiian education once again embody cultural knowledge of traditional and contemporary thought of all facets through our language, solely through our language?
I'll start. So can Hawaiian education embody, solely Hawaiian education embody our cultural knowledge? That's language and culture? Absolutely. And I think it can embody so much more, right? I think I always think of things as sort of like a puzzle, right? And the more pieces you put together, the richer that knowledge, that perspective, that na'auao is. So when you marry language and culture, I think the way you are able to understand things is expanded because you have access. You have access to millions of pages of kakao, right? Of palapala that were left. I mean, I cannot, and I you know, people who have learned language, you know, when you think about if I never, right, if I couldn't, all the things that I wouldn't have access to, and I would have to rely on the English, which is good if it's all you got, right? But right, when I think about the place we're at today, we have the opportunities to learn, right? It is out there. That wasn't so 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? We didn't have all of these opportunities to learn culture, to learn language, and all kinds of other things. So if it can embody, of course, but I also think language can encompass a lot more. You know, when I think the first time I saw that Ha'awina Make Makika, you know, that little book that they had from the 1890s. I mean, I'm still trying, I can't even understand math in English, but, you know, just the idea that, you know, things that we struggle with today, those are things that people just embraced, right? Hawaiian was the way of dealing with the world in general. And right now, I don't think that we should limit Hawaiian to just Hawaiian things, because that's not what our kupuna dirida, right? When you read, you know, Sini Kalela and, you know, all those, they applied it in every context. So in my mind, that hopefully someday we can also do the same, right? We can talk about world politics and math and science and we do, right? We do. I don't know if we do it as well as we want to do it, but we do, and we're trying, and that's the main thing, right? Because to me, if people tell me, you know, Kahele, what, you think everybody going to talk Hawaiian at some point? I was like, oh, frick, I hope so. It's like, I wouldn't be doing this if I thought that wasn't something that was possible. That being said, it's not just everybody talking Hawaiian, it's everybody talking Hawaiian, practicing culture, making our own decisions, having whatever form of political power, right? That enables us to do those things, right? In every context. So I do think that language is part of that, right? Is part of that na'awao, and that also that engagement, right? In today's world, right? What we're doing in today's world, because nobody's going to give us that 30 years of immersion. And we know we just there because they couldn't figure out how to tell us no, or they did and we never let them, right? So it is a constant struggle. It's a constant battle not just to maintain what we have, but we got to get beyond that, right? Where we begin to strategize how we strengthen that, how we spread that, how we expand those opportunities. Mahalo.
I'll jump in. I'm gonna address it a little bit, because I'm gonna say that the question I believe you're asking, Hiapo, is there this realistic ability to return to where we came from? And part of that, I'll start off with just an interpretive story that till this day, most of us carry the that strong claim of Kauikeoli Heopuni Palapala Ko. And I think, Kale, you know, in a presentation, it was one of the things that I thought about at that time. I was really into just the brain development in early childhood of Hawaiian students, and the mobility of the brain in those moments that once you move through a process where the way that you learn, the things that you learn, and I'm seeing that there is potentially this concept of a Hawaiian brain or Hawaiian thinking, and that existed prior to any of these conversations that we're having right now. But we come from something. We come from a way of being. We come from an educational path. We come from just characteristic traits and behaviors that were guided by the way that we were raised and the way that we thought. And now moving into a space of literacy and the dependence upon literacy, that was where, and I'm using this story because this is a space of contemplation that I was in, is that was in actuality that phrase Heopuni Palapala Ko'u, was that a phrase of strength, or was that a marked pinpoint in our history where our brains changed, our education changed, that now the idea, and so I tell that story because part of my answer right now is that there's just, and this is again a conversational space of contemplation, that part of this is unrealistic, that many of the families that for us sitting here, some folks that have engaged in language in the level that many of us have tried to, or believe all of us should, for most of our people, that becomes unrealistic. So to ask, can we get back to that point? I want to say conceptually, sure. I want to focus more on the iterative product processes to get us there, because I think that there's no pill we can swallow to get to that point. And I think, and I'm going to kind of, Ili Makalamai, I might be giving up my question, so we can just talk longer on this, if that's okay with everybody. But that when you see the actual volume that our communities are showing us right now, in the space of desire for cultural education, and I'm specifically saying cultural education and language education, and then cultural education through our language, that these are doorways of opportunities that really don't exist yet. And I believe they're really integral to get us to the place that you're having us contemplate right now, Hiapo. And so there is a part of me right now that in the space that folks are conceived of, or ideas are conceived of as unrealistic, that we don't have enough time for it to continue to be unrealistic, that we've got to build as the, we're the educational architects. We're the architects of educational programming to iteratively move through this consideration space and help our collective, our lahui, all the people of Hawaii, dare I say, move into more of an ideologically Hawaiian point of mainframe or fundamental perspective, because those people throughout the future are going to make decisions for our aina, for each other, for the endangered species that will no longer exist in that time frame, because we have a difficulty deciding whether or not their freedoms are equal to that of ours as humans. That in the space of education, it's really moving, and this will be the last thing I say. It's moving from it looking unrealistic to making it a must, making it imperative that we get our people there.
For me, this is nothing new, and I've spoken about before. But for me, I think it's part of the confusion, and I'll be straight up, when we somehow believe you can actually separate education, what we call Hawaiian language education, so-called Hawaiian culture education, and I'm going to add, of course, conscious of politics. That is part of our subjugation, I believe, when we somehow believe you can actually teach Hawaiian without the cultural context and without the politics. And part of it just took, for example, let's take a phrase like ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono. We can pronounce it, we can say it, we probably could translate it. Is that it? Do we understand it as a cultural meaning? And what does it mean if you're not actively involved or pursuing ua mau ke ea o ka aina I ka pono? Does it have any meaning? And so, for me, I've always been clear. I don't have the answer, but I know the trajectory. The trajectory is to be na'awau, all of those so-called pieces, and I use the word pieces, I hate to use the word pieces because they're really all wanting the same thing, just as you would say, opposite sides of the coin. I used to talk about, like, you cannot talk about being a taro farmer. In fact, you can know everything about taro. Your tutu taught you everything about taro. But if you get no political will to control, to go fight water, it's meaningless. On the other hand, in the same way, I can get all the water flowing down my kuleana. I can get a nice awai. But if I have no consciousness or understanding culturally of how to grow taro, it'll also be meaningless. And so in today's world, really in today's world, to function as a Kanaka, and I'm just using taro farming as an example, but to function really as a Kanaka in this world, you have to understand and see all of those pieces really intertwined as one and the same. Because in order to speak Hawaiian, you got to have political power. We all know this. The only reason we have Hawaiian language in the schools is because parents and educators and those had to fight politically. In the same sense, you had cultural, kupuna who refused to give up their language. And many of them, as Brother Hiapo has suggested, some of the last ones are passing away right now. And so when I think about education, especially in the context of education, and I look at education institutions, and whether we're talking Hawaiian language immersion, charter schools, Kamehameha schools, whatever it be, I think we're doing a disservice when we don't connect. And those are just three pieces, where we don't connect all of the pieces. What is it to speak Hawaiian if you got no aina? What is it to have aina if you don't speak and understand Hawaiian? You see that and to me, and this is, I think sometimes it's comfortable to kind of think, oh, I'm doing something Hawaiian. And so we kind of stay in these isolated boxes thinking we're really moving. In reality, it's just part of the movement. But I know, that's why I keep on saying, I think that trajectory really is the most important element. Where are we heading? What is the purpose of Hawaiian education? Is it just to, I mean, I'm going to use Mauna Kea, is it just to go name some telescopes? Is it just to go put up some signs in Hawaiian up there that says, you know, that you can translate? Or is it just political? So I want to stop the telescopes, you see? And again, you can see that also is only half the answer. And so whether it's our politics, whether we're talking about our language, whether it's talking about our cultural knowledge, we can look at examples like Mauna Kea, where you know, it's really the nexus of all of those elements has to be intertwined really for it to be effective and really for it to push us where we need to go. Because what was taken from us wasn't just the language, wasn't just our cultural ideas, wasn't just our political power, wasn't just our land, wasn't just our water, wasn't just the control of our educational system, wasn't just our minds, but all of the above. And so in order to combat, I guess, the effects of what has been done to our people, I think what we need to really do is really think about it in a real more holistic way, really think about it in a way that intertwines all of that. Because in order to speak, I don't want to just sound like a Hawaiian. I want to speak like a Hawaiian. I want to speak like a Hawaiian on my own land. I want to speak like a Hawaiian as someone that is of this land, from our cosmogonies from this land. Because to me, until we move to that point, we never going to really speak and sound and talk and be so-called Hawaiian. So the pursuit of being Hawaiian to me is the most important element. Not to say that we're ever going to get there, but I think just to have this kind of trajectory is most important, especially when we talk about education today. What is Hawaiian education today if it doesn't entail all of the above? So anyway, mahalo.
Yeah, kako ia, mahalo nui. The process is the trajectory is of utmost importance, because the day in and day out within that walking is the one that grows us, right? And to know that this separation of language and culture and all of the other pieces, so true. We've inherited that, right, from the generation before us, from a couple of generations before us, and those that are still with us are still pumping that idea, right? Language and culture is separate. Why? Because you know, you cannot all over here and all over there. And I think like you just said so eloquently, that all the pieces got to come together to embody that, not just 1, 2, or 3. So mahalo you everyone.
Okay, Kalehua, going to bring us into the community with your question.
Okay. Shucks, man, I got like 47 other questions I want to ask now. Looking at the quantity of interest, because I'm going to go back, I kind of described it, but in looking at the interest that our communities are showing us for programs, like they're hungry for anything, again, in the space of culture and language. And I know we've already kind of dissected the utilization of those two terms separately. But in any way, shape, or form, our communities are hungry for learning in a space of potentially what I'll call Hawaiian ideological learning. How do we, as the educational architects, resolve or work through how do we actually address that interest without the quantity, without foregoing quality? Or is that realistic? Okay.
I'll take a stab first. I think I think we got to talk about what we think is quality, right? Because I think that's different depending on the context. And I think that's different depending on lots of things. But if we are talking about, if we're talking specifically about like immersion education, right? Because I think that's a pressure we're feeling at the moment, right? We have 100 empty teaching positions. And we have people on waiting lists at almost every school. And we are not producing enough teachers. So even if we're talking about quantity as far as number, and then we have to talk about quality. I think at some point, and I know that all of us work in the trenches, right? So this is a sort of time for us to like, sort of look up and be like, you know, a moment of, you know, how do we strategize towards something different? And I think, we have to start to do some work to change the institution. Like if I'm talking about immersion, right? We've done a lot of work over the last 30 years. And you know, this is just my experience in immersion. My first probably 5 years in immersion was providing the kind of education, engaging the students in the kind of education that I really felt that was Hawaiian focused, right? Whether it be language or culture, and shielding what we were doing from the Department of Education so that, and they couldn't understand us anyway, right? But so kind of doing what we needed to do and kind of just placating them like, yeah, it's just about language. That's all we're doing. It's all the same, whatever. And then, you know, probably about 10 to 20 years into immersion, you know, it started to, you know, we started to be vocal about the fact that, well, it's not just the same. Yeah, this education is different and it should be different. I think we should probably begin, and we have in small ways, but probably spend the next couple decades really trying to break that institutional paradigm that has kept us hostage, right? You know, how many periods a day, the math, English, you know, like that kind of stuff. I think we really have to start to address those kinds of things, because if you really think about it, that's what's killing our teachers, right? Not you know, the fact that a fifth grade teacher has to teach all the preps, right? English, math, science, address the Western stuff, address the Hawaiian stuff. And it's difficult to maintain rigor for everything. Or, you know what I mean? It dilutes everything, right? When you're trying to do everything. So I sort of think that we should begin really to start to hack away at that institutional structure, right? To make way for the kind of learning I think that we all envision, you know, in different ways, but it's like they still have us by the throat, right? And we need to break that. We need to break that in order for us to get to the kind of quality education that we think is quality, and not, you know, trying to do that, but appease them because, you know, we gotta follow the standards. And then sometimes we get tricked into believing that the standards is the thing, right? And then we don't do the kinds of things that we think of as Hawaiian education. Anyway, that was a lot of babbling, but.
Yeah, go jump. Let Hiapo clean up. No, I mean, I think that's a real difficult question, you know, quantity, quality kind of question. I remember having these discussions back with Noea Warner a long time ago, especially with Hawaiian immersion. And he was, of course, as an educational minded person, especially about quality of language. And I remember having these discussions with him, and I would say, hey, I'd rather have somebody just learn how to count in Hawaiian to 10. I mean, to me, this idea of, because I know for the masses of, this is probably because for the masses of our people, just to count to 10 in Hawaiian is part of that process. And so, this balance of quality and quantity, I think, is a very difficult balance, especially in education, especially when you're servicing the needs of our communities out there, Hawaiian communities. And so, on one hand, we have to keep the quality. We understand it as best as we can. On the other hand, we're trying to service as many of our people to actually just open the door so they can start the process of so-called reculturalizing themselves or re-educating themselves or re-identifying themselves as Kanaka. And this is part of the mandate that we have as educators. When we think about Hawaiian education, we must remember, and I think this is important. I'm going to quote Kwame Ture. As he says, Kwame Ture has a very famous quote. He says, you can never analyze the oppressed. Never analyze the oppressed. So if we're going to look at the oppressed and look at our peoples, the subjugated peoples, it's the first thing we got to realize, we are dominated people. We are subjugated people. We're not just people that enjoying and have these powers of self-determination in our homeland. No, we are subjugated people. So we got to be quite honest. But Kwame Ture says, never analyze the conditions of the oppressed without involving in that analysis the role of the so-called oppressor, the subjugator, and the effects of subjugation or oppression. Because if you don't, you start blaming the so-called subjugated or the so-called oppressed for their own condition. See, in other words, if we look at education, we got to understand, education, it has been about settlerism. It has been about the process of subjugating our people, about erasure. And so what I'm trying to say is that our education is something that's already, it's not neutral, so it's already in response to all of this. And so we're dealing with questions of quality and quantity. It gets further magnified in regards to the issues that we have to face, because it's not as simple as just keeping quality. See, this is part of the issue, because for most of our people, they still have not even raised the consciousness to even think about why they should even learn Hawaiian language, or they need to even understand our own history. We have been so robbed of our soul identity, and so using Kwame Ture's, we cannot blame ourselves for our own condition. You see, we must understand that our people are in a subjugated position. And so when we're dealing with the uplift of our people, we have to deal with that question from that way. So it might be a long process. It might take 20, 30, 40 years. It might take multiple prongs. It might take quality. My point is, I don't think there's one fix. I think it has to come from multiple prong effect. Maybe we have to deal with institutional stuff at a very quality level of language or culture or politics. At the same time, we have to find ways to service the masses of people that we have out there. And, in regards to what the people need, I think Paulo Freire with his whole, again, the pedagogy of the oppressed, that we must also recognize that our own peoples, even in the situation of being subjugated or have been robbed of our own identity, even they still have knowledge that is still very applicable and still very relevant in this whole process. And that's why I hate to think of, this mentality sometimes where we see, the knowledge is all there at the university. All we gotta do is get some of that stuff and sprinkle that on our heads, and our people are gonna grow. Instead of, the approach has to be starting from the ground up. I think that's the approach. It's not again, iali ino kiali ke kanaka. I think we have this idea, we just gotta get one good ali'i and we all be saved. Instead of thinking, no, it's really about teaching and working with our people. The idea of kuleana to be of service, to start to use our own ways of knowing that still exist in much of our families. Even the idea of ike aku ike mai, koku aku koku mai, pelaka no hona Hawaiʻi. For most of our families, that is something that we can start off. So there is still this kind of ike that we can start from. And hopefully, I'm not pointing the fingers at the so-called academics at the university level, but I think that is part of the piliki that we have, is somehow that idea that the knowledge is out there, and if that we need to kind of look there for salvation, when in reality, those so-called educators, especially at the university levels, they need to be working in the community. And I'm going to just end with this last story. I'm not going to mention the name, but I remember this was Hiapo might have been there. In fact, this was at the shucks, what was the Hawaiian? Remember we had that Hawaiian language contest, Ahakane one year. So Ahakane, there was a Hawaiian language contest, and I remember. And they had two things going on. So they had the Ahakane Hawaiian language contest was going on, speaking, telling a story. And in the other room, they had a huge talk about lua that was going on. And I would say probably 95% of our Hawaiian men were all in that room. Well, 5–10% was in the Hawaiian language room. And I was talking to another professor who was saying, you know, Kaleikoa, what is wrong with our people? How come our people, you know, how come they're not coming here? And I remember telling that person, well, I think that's the issue. We thinking the people is supposed to come here. The problem is, how come we not there? You see, that's my point. As Hawaiian language people, how come we not there? In other words, we should be going to where the people are instead of somehow waiting for the people to come here. So anyway, mahalo.
I think the only thing I will clean up is my own mess, but you know, it really is. You know, like Kahele was saying, is so true. 30 plus years of the Hawaiian education, and it produced numbers, right? But if we're going to continue on doing the same thing over and over and over again, then what are we doing? What are we really doing? If we're not taking a new, a deeper look, and to me, because yeah, it produced the numbers, but you know, we have to realize that the hemorrhage is for real. Our schools, our teachers is so overexhausted. The hemorrhage is for real. And not only the physical hemorrhage, but the educational hemorrhage as well, right? Talking about the new teachers but what about the teachers that have been there for 5, 10, 15 years? How are we feeding them, right? How are we giving them new, making them strong for another 5, 10, 15 years? And so, okay, you produce the numbers, but like my dear friend Kealohi Rapun, when she coined the term cultural atrophy, right? You produce all of these numbers, but you know, then okay, you can speak Hawaiian, but what you speaking about? And what are you really? Are we talking Hawaiian? Are we moving in that trajectory to talk Hawaiian and think Hawaiian a bit, or are we just speaking English with Hawaiian words, right? And then we can go down that rabbit hole as well. So quality and quantity, you know, is like what you call it. It has to go hand in hand, right? It has to go hand in hand. It cannot be one over the other. You of course you need the numbers, but with the numbers you have to have and that ali'i ana also. I wanted to hulo. You know, Kaleikoa brought it up twice tonight about that ali'i ana. You know, part of that ali'i ana is taking responsibility ourselves as well. Not pointing the finger that, oh, I never have, and oh, you can, and I don't can. And that ali'i ana in each and every one of us is the taking of the responsibility, right? Ku neki na ku au hau li'i noho I lalo. Hokahi vale no ku au hau pi'i kaʻio ko ke ali'i. And that ali'i is our Hawaiianness, our ʻŌlelo. And in order to keep that, where's the responsibility? Right here, right? Right here, and then in you, and then in me, and then together, and then so the quality and the quantity must go hand in hand. But we gotta realize that. We gotta realize that, we gotta want that, right? And so when we're moving in that trajectory, number one, we're moving in that trajectory. But number two, how are we moving, right? And what we're moving towards, and we gotta keep on moving that way. And you know what, really. If you don't can, fine, but make sure your children will be there, right? Make sure you open the door for your mo'opunas to be there. Okay, and sometimes we gotta take the bullet. And we take the bullet now, I don't can. I'm 75 years old, I don't can. Right on. That fire you get, make sure your mo'opuna gonna be in there, right? Because like Kahele said, we take that, we're gonna gamble that 2, 3, decades. Let's go. But what we're doing in that time to bring it back. that's important, right? So my little try to clean up my mess, but Kalehua Mahalo Nui.
Yeah. And Kalehua, please share why this has been on your mind and your mana'o about this. How you been thinking about it lately?
Yeah, no, I'll just share too, because in my life I've set myself up for a whole bunch of just traps, and then I end up having to kind of, yank the umi'i and get my foot out, because I'm stepping in all of these holes, and there are all these holes because of a lack of just understanding or consciousness, or not knowing the context fully well. And I think one of them that got me to this point was just this idea of, and I say this in kako'o, not as like one ʻŌlelo ku'e kimana, but that questioning iola ka'olelo Hawaii. That was kind of a mantra that I think, I based a lot of decisions for my own family, for myself professionally, for my community in some of the what I consider service work, giving back to the community, and it all surrounded ʻŌlelo Hawaii, and I just let it be for a little while that iola ka'olelo Hawaii, and then I came, it was quite a while back, but getting to the point where it's like, whoa, shucks, well, what's the actual point? Like why are we learning our language? Is it just so that these words are spoken, or is it just so that the grammar is alive and people have it in their brains? Like, what's the actual tangible outcome of language learning? And then what's the tangible outcome of walking ourselves through anything cultural in a educational space in state institutions, and really trying to find the answer that I think for myself, I found my answer. And it goes back to this idea of he ali'i ka ʻaina he kaua ke kanaka. That all of our processes as kanaka have been established to better our place, to leave our place better than we found it. And that the language of our ancestors was a derivative of those behaviors, a derivative of those beliefs and those values, and that our ideology was like imported from generation to generation through that ʻŌlelo. So as we were talking about in the first question, is really trying to figure out, like, well, why is cultural education important, in today's society? Because ultimately, the trap I fell into for 10 years was, what kind of job we gonna get? And even though right now my brain is telling me, with 100 vacancies, Kahele, get plenty of jobs, so go to Kulanui, get a teaching license, and then, but you see that trajectory that I just took myself through, that the equational logic in that is, the whole thing's flawed, because we don't control, we don't have ownership over the processes that guide us to those points. That was one of the things that even generating the Kaʻeo, the Hawaiian language assessment, being a part of the beginning and lifting that process up, it was really apparent that we were, jumping through the hoops of a system we don't control. Now I rationalize with myself in that moment that we have to do that to build up our appearance, or the optic that we are legitimate enough to sit at the proverbial table. Now, I still kind of believe that because of the nature of politics that Kaleo was talking about, and Anakala Pokalai Nui, walking the crooked path straight, which he overlays in his process of engaging in systems, but really trying to look at teacher licensure. Do we control that? So the whole process to that point, to get there, is run by ideologically someone different than what we want for our children. You brought up Common Core state standards, Kahele. That's developed as a monolingually developed standard for children developing through one language, as native speakers of that language. That does not have our children. And I'll say, I will go back to those traps that I set in my mind, because I still say I can explain to the legislature that as a bilingual quote unquote state, that's an inappropriate standard automatically out the gate. You know, but that's the trap that we're setting. I mean, what I set for myself is that we're always using that ambient, you know, what one author calls mother culture, to guide all of our thinking and to guide all of our path. And sometimes we can't even hear her speaking into our ear, telling us like, oh, we gotta just get, you know, more teachers to licensure. And I think that there's quality, and I'll, you know, cut it short so we can move on. But we don't have a bilingual superintendent. You know, we just started the process of getting bilingual Board of Education. All the while I'm talking about superintendent, the system structure, which is out of my control, out of our control. The diploma is not in our control of what we want out of our students. The testing is out of our control. Almost every guiding light that sends all of us, the communities, into that path, out of our control. So when we go back to the idea of what is all of this for, I think, you know, and the community is showing this interest, and I think they inherently understand the importance of identity. And I think we can take that further and explain to them that we might be running out of time, you know, in the space of overdevelopment, the polluting of an aquifer, the amount of tourists that come to our place without regulation, the housing crisis. I mean, there are multiple aspects to look at. Decision making is flawed, and so we're trying to, as a community, build this critical mass of folks that think differently or want differently. And so for me, I feel like because of this, you know, shortish time frame that we're working under, we have to be able to engage in multiple you know, we have to open up other doorways of opportunity, which may mean, like Kaleo was talking about, maybe teaching colors and numbers is enough, as long as we're teaching imu and kalo and leaving your place better and collective give back and decentralizing decision making from humanity into our entire world. That we have the power to leave water and birds and fish and limu and reef better than we found it. Because in all this conversation, even for myself, unfortunately, my ear just still hears all of us talking about humans. And I don't know what to think about that. That maybe humans are the path for a better ecological world. But you know, I just think in our communities that the interest that we have, there's an imperative to meet the interest. For myself, we have to, like, you know, I feel like they're telling us to do something, and we have to listen to them, and we have to engineer programming to meet them where they need us to meet them. That's where I was coming from.
Mahalo nui. So I just want to do a time check. So we're at 7:53, and Kahele has a great closing question for us. We have one question in the Q&A from our Maui Tita Maluhialo that I'll get to after we do a round with everybody for Kahele's question. And then we will go ahead and close out. So we might go over just a little bit, but yeah, we got a little bit of time left. So Kahele, take it away.
Okay, so I don't know if this is a question or more of a challenge, but the idea that, you know, I believe in synergy. You know, I believe that making connections with people like we are right now is meaningful, and that it should, right? This kind of thinking and this kind of discussion should lead to some kind of action. So my question to everybody in this room is, what can we, like literally, what are we going to do next? Like, you know, when we talk about, I don't know who made that I don't know whose quote this is, but the idea that, what is the one that you know what one does, but you never know what one does. Oh, Foucault, sorry. Okay, so Foucault's quote. But I mean, I'm a believer in that. I mean, I like to do stuff, right? Like I want to get down and do something. And I know that everybody in this room, in this virtual room, we think about this stuff every day, right? So what is one thing that we can continue to do, right? As using this conversation as a springboard, what could we do, right? What small thing or big thing could we do to address some of the issues that we talked about? And I just made a list of a few of them. Teacher licensure, state standards, the romanticization of na'au, because I love that, right? The idea of, there is shit to learn, right? And we should be getting to it. What are we doing for our teachers? What are we doing to feed them, right? To make them, to help them, to support them, to be able to do their jobs. And then the other one was testing, and there may be more, but I was just thinking about, I mean, you know, things start by just starting, like the big, you know, like Kumulipo, it just happens. So ideas.
Okay, I just jump. Well, I always start with one of the quotes I always use. I mean, various versions of the quote, but you know, wahia kupuna e ike ka hoa kanaka o kipa heva ke aloha I ka ilio. I think for me, what it really says to me is that we have to first look to our, you know, look to each other first. And whether you're talking about, you know, Kamehameha schools, or you're talking at the University of Hawaii, teacher training programs, you know, the various educational programs, colleges, you know, there's still this tendency somehow to believe that we have to measure to some kind of measurement out there. You know, there's this idea that whether it's SATs or whether it's, you know, being able to send supposedly our best and our brightest to, you know, to Harvard, whatever it is. You know, I think, again, when I talk about trajectory, to me, that's the beginning of the discussion, because I think we have to be clear that to be critical is not the same as criticizing. And so all of us who are involved with education have to be willing, and with some passion, nothing wrong with passion, you see, but we have to be willing to engage in these kinds of discussions, to really ask those hard questions. What I see as being the biggest problem today is that when you have Hawaiian educational, I mean, I don't know if you guys been to some of the so-called Hawaiian educational conventions or you know, meaning, it kind of seemed like you get the private school guys, they do this thing here, you get the university guys, they stay over there, the Hawaiian immersion Kulakaiapuni guys is over here, the charter. So there seems to be this kind of conversations going on in silos about where we need to head. And we're not having these kind of conversations across campuses, across genres, across different kind of educational institutions, because I'm a big believer, not one of us has the answer, but all of us together can find the answer. You see, we have to be willing, we have to put our egos aside, we have to be loving enough to one another to discuss, to argue, to debate. And I'm sharing this because what I find a lot of times, especially in education, there's this kind of sense like, you know, as long as we kind of moving along in a nice way and we don't kind of, it's as if education is nothing political about education. See, that's the point. It's like this kind of like safe world where as long as you're teaching math or you're doing these things, you know, you're kind of heading some kind of, making some kind of forward progress. And I'm a big believer that that's a failure on all of our part, that we don't have the nerve in many ways to sit and discuss and debate and to critically analyze one another, to put forward. And in fact, in education, I would argue education, in fact, is the most political institution. It is the most political institution. It was the institution that robbed us of our minds. our souls in many ways, you know, which again made us become complicit in our own so-called oppression. And therefore, across the board, we have to find ways to first acknowledge that, you know, we're fighting an upstream battle, and it's going to take all of us together finding the best ways to move forward as a people, as a lahui. And again, that's why for me, public education has been the most important, because it is the vast majority of our people are in these so-called schools. Whether in Hawaiian immersion, of course, the vast majority are in English so-called DOE schools. And so to kind of answer Kylie's question, I think that's, to me, that's a critical element before we kind of, you know, set up some kind of sitting together to, you know, pretend like somehow we are moving as one. I still believe the core element is ideology. As the great Kwame Ture says, the only struggle that matters is the struggle over ideology. And so for me, what is the ideology of this Hawaiian education? What is this ideology to be an educated Hawaiian? What is this ideology in which we somehow believe that whether it's language, whether it's culture, whether it's politics, what is that? And I think that we have to start there. We have to kind of create this constant conversation, and again, constant conversation that will continually looking to transform and push us into the direction that we want to go. But we can never get there if we're not talking to one another. We can never get there unless we're debating with one another, unless we're challenging one another. And so for me, going back to that said, ike ka hoa kanaka o kipa heva ke aloha ka ilio, to me is most appropriate.
Yeah, mahalo nui, kako opiha. I was thinking about three things basically, and the first one is that I'm not going to stand up and say ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi, ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi, ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. I don't do it myself, you know. The kula ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi and then send my kids someplace else. I'm not calling anybody else. I'm talking about me. Okay, so you know, my wife and I decided this. Our girls from 8 weeks old, they was in ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. I mean, it's a non-question in our house, right? ʻŌlelo Hawaiʻi. Now, because we gotta be the best that we can, so that we can turn around and help, right? With ike hoa kanaka. So true, so true. Putting our egos aside, that right there, right? To come together, to work together, so true, right? That's number one. Number two is that in 30 plus years of doing whatever I was doing, I kind of got traction on some things and I missed the boat on a lot of things, right? So whenever I have opportunities like this to listen to Kaleikoa and to listen to Kahele and to listen to Kalehua, I pay attention, right? Because that for me is a weakness, okay? And I gotta know that, and I gotta get stronger in that. Okay, I may have been doing one thing for this time, but I gotta now do, because it all adds up to the whole in the end, right? So knowing my weakness and knowing how to fix that, right? Because if I fix my weakness, everybody benefits. Okay. And the third thing is that my grandfather told me from before, don't ever go outside and tell everybody how honor your beef stew is, right? You cook your beef stew, you feed people, and you let them turn around and tell everybody else how honor your beef stew is. In other words, give them, teach them, help them, give it all, right? Because they're gonna come back and they're gonna give again, right? They're gonna come back and they're gonna give again. So the Kaleikoa, mahalo nui, putting the damn ego aside, right? Only one ego over here. That's our ʻŌlelo. That's our ali'i, right? Our Hawaiianness, our the political thing. That is the ego we should be taking care of, and not our own individual. And I'm all this, and you are that, and PhD, and which means crap to me. PhD mean nothing to me if I cannot go and help my teachers who's been there for 5, 10, 15 years. I go crap on them because they get bad pronunciation or saying that. Go over there, go help them, right? Shut your mouth and go over there, go help them. It's exactly. So I want to mahalo everything. All what you guys said, you got. I want you to know I'm always paying attention, right? Always listening, because I gotta figure out my weakness and I gotta make that strong so I can add to the pot as well. And when the kahea come out, show up, right? So when when Kahele called me, I'm going because, you know, I just love to hang around her, period. But I'm going because that's what we got to do. Aloha nui.
Hey, aloha. Yeah, I think that's the hardest part for me is because it always brings it back to this idea of imperative. You know, that we have to get as many people walking through this you know, educational ideology as fast as we can in Hawaii. And you know, I think that the trying to look at the conversations on, because I'll be honest with you guys, is that I don't really feel like we have too much time to have ego. I mean, I don't know how, you know, to wait for the time that you know, I'll go back to, and I know it's a word that is being thrown around a lot, but the idea of desecrating our resources or desecrating our land, we're at a critical point right now, and I think that it would behoove us all to understand that the nature of what makes Hawaii is at stake. It's on a precipice. And that has to be more important than any of the other things that we have in place, you know. And I speak strongly about that because, you know, if I hope that when we do get together, like tomorrow morning, because that's as fast as this got to happen, that we do advocate for Kaleikoa, whoever that Hawaiian the Hawaiian ideological educated Hawaiian that you were trying to bring up in the front. We got to get someone like that to be the superintendent. We got to get people on the Board of Education right now in the structures that we have to walk the crooked path straight. You know, because I think for right now in the educational system, we're either teaching our children how to care for themselves and just themselves and just their family and just their grandchildren and buy them a house and buy them land and not think about anyone else in the individualistic mindset and perspective of the whole entire system, that we're allowing the system to teach our children that, or we're not teaching them how to malama aina, how to leave your place better than you found it, how to engage in that Hawaiian ideology in whatever way, shape, or form. And so, like for me, the most difficult part is that we can utilize. I mean, we can wait to have this this meeting of the minds to dismantle our individual egos as humans. I'm just wondering at what point in time do the folks in the audience and everyone else just begin to encourage our systems, our principles. I can share with you what we're doing at our school is ʻŌlelo Hawaii from kindergarten all the way to 8th grade, and we're not a kaiapuni or kaiōʻolelo school. We're not an immersion school yet, you know. But it's that important that we speak our language because it helps us to understand Hawaiian ideology. All of our kids learn how. About fish, about gutting fish, about processing fish, animals, pigs, planting all of our trees, our histories, our songs, our dances, revitalizing the reef outside the school. We're doing all of this just as this walk through what I believe at a really broad level is Hawaiian ideology, and hopefully that the embedded wisdom that the kupuna inserted in all of those practices helps to shape them in that critical moment in their developmental stage of their life to become something different and something not just reminiscent of this antiquated understanding of what a quote unquote Hawaiian romanticized Hawaiian is, but really squeeze the sponge of kupuna wisdom to give all of our children whatever we can right now, because these decisions and this type of education has to happen now. And if we don't all feel that, then I think that's the whisper of mother culture again in our ear, describing our realm of captivity, and maybe we can't even find the terminal edges of that captivity, or we don't want even we don't want to break out of the cage. And so, I mean, for me, I'll just leave it at that. And I know I know how all of it sounds, but the programming hopefully is to engage students immediately in practices to have more access to indigenous wisdom through walking through those practices and speaking the language of the people that developed that.
Mahalo. It's really cool that you know, the thing about education, once you're in education, is it's really you get in the weeds. So if you get educators in the room, you can start talking about all this technical stuff with the most passion, you know, anybody can talk about technical stuff with, or structural things. And so I appreciate your question, Kahele. And you kind of like you always do, because you are one that likes to do, you know, put out these real kind of concrete structural pieces. And then the nature of the minds in this room also took it to this, continue to take it to this philosophical level. And that is important. And those conversations got to be had. And everybody probably in the participants or in the audience here is familiar with you folks, but just in case not, as much as these minds can speak politically and philosophically, they do the nitty gritty, backbreaking hard work that it takes to forward and maintain educational spaces for our keiki and our opio every day. We have one brave question, and so I'm gonna pose it out there and then we'll close up, and thank you everybody for hanging on a little bit longer. But again, this is our tita, Maluhia Lo, Keikio Maui, and going to school at UH Manoa. And so I'm just gonna summarize, Malu, your question, but in thinking about power and systemic issues in Hawaiian education and Hawaiian ideology, is there a place for a gendered analysis? And in thinking about gender in relationship to these issues and these structures, is there a way to think about those things in a way that benefits the discussion around power pertaining to Hawaiian education? And I think just while you guys all contemplate a little bit, this is, I appreciate your question, Malu, because it's getting to, sometimes we speak just in generalities, right? Hawaiians. And there's these other sort of intersecting aspects to who we are that diversify who we are and maybe necessitate specificity when thinking about education. And so Malu is asking that in regards to gender.
Yeah, I'll speak to that because, and I'll try to keep it as short as possible, I promise. Oh, let me just try to make sure I'm getting the question right. Yeah, so this is where ideologically, our people, I'm gonna say maybe I'm, you know, and I've been called, you know, that I romanticize, but I love our kupuna. And I love the world that they built. Now, it wasn't perfect. By any means, it was not perfect. But I love them, and I love their level of intellect. I love their wisdom. And not only were they still alive when white men encountered them, but their world thrived. The land, everything thrived. And that's enough data for me to dig into this. And I'll answer the question. I just want to make sure I set that up front, because when we look at issues of gender, sexual identification, our culture didn't have the grasp or the negative clutches that the society that we have now. And I think walking through studying the way that the kupuna interacted with terms like mahu, with terms like aikane, when we walk through how the kupuna interacted with them, I think the first stage and the beauty of this education of looking at how the kupuna actually felt about this is that it automatically helps individuals who in this contemporary world that are struggling through these ideas and the identification in this realm. It automatically gives some sense of reprieve. There's a release of the pressure valve, because if you look deeply enough, it's not even an issue, you know. And I say that in looking in the newspapers for these things. I've looked a lot, and the concept, not only are the concepts not talked about in a negative way, it's almost like there was this and I always say it this way, that food was regulated in that way with kapu, and sexuality in itself didn't, it wasn't what we think of it today, and I'll keep it broad. But as far as understanding the way that our kupuna would walk children, generations through this, and not make it an issue, and not make it something that was frowned upon or negative, is I think that there is a beauty to understanding the traditional understanding of that, traditional aspects of that. And I think that the more and more I walk through an educational pathway that is based upon or focused upon Hawaiian ideology, you're going to get to, number one, that place of psychological reprieve, that when I can identify as a Hawaiian, when I can identify with my ancestors and I belong to them, then you belong to their beliefs and their values, and then all of their beliefs and values and their language transfer into praxis. It transfers into behaviors and actual actions, because there is a fight that has to take place nowadays, you know. And I understand that there's a creation story for Wake and Papa. I know how we got to the Aikapu. I know how we got to the Halemua and the Halenoa for segregated eating. Now, with that said, I'm just going to put that out there, is that until you understand, until you walk through a process by which you can understand that it's very difficult to place mother culture's, the ideology that mother culture has shaped on traditional understanding. Because I would explain that when men teach men and women teach women in those spaces, and sexuality and identification is fluid between the two, then you need each other. And that's the beauty of that type of living condition, that type of construct, is that there is not one person out there that can do it all. You always need that there's a societal construct to need each other, to collaborate, and to work together so that we are always unified. And that's only one potential inference.
Mahalo, Kalehua. Maybe one more person wanna take a stab? I'm actually gonna chime in on that one too. Azamakula.
I mean, I think like everything, right? It deserves that critical discussion, because we have what we would, you know, when we think about our culture, our traditional culture, right? And we use that as a way to inform us today. We take that and we continue to make culture, right? Culture is not static. So when I think about our views on gender or sexuality, right? We can learn what our kupuna did, and that can inform what we would like to see today. The one thing that I would say is that, and so we build that understanding, we build that culture, we build those traditions that we want for ourselves and for our keiki. I would say that we should look at these issues the way we look at most things, right? We look to our past, it informs us. We look at our situation, and we strategize forward. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be my answer for most sort of modern concepts, right? To kind of deconstruct it first, right? What are we thinking about? What do we need? What is our situation? And then we move, we create what we want to see. That's what we do in education. That's what we're doing in language. That's what we do for everything. So I would apply the same sort of strategy, I guess. You want to say something?
Can I?
Be quick.
So, I think it's a real good question. The difficulty, of course, that I would probably say is that, well, first of all, we got to locate that anytime we're talking about the so-called othering, it always has to do with power. And so the exertion of power, especially in today's society, right, is tainted in many ways because of our so-called history of being under so-called the Euro-American hegemony. And therefore, certain issues that occur within that power structure will appear within the Hawaiian question. So whether we're talking about gender, sexuality, and for me, class. And I think it's a very important question that needs to be put into the discussion, especially as we talk about struggling against the so-called empire. You see, that's the point. In that empire, sexuality and gender and class, as well as others, are part of the mechanisms of control or the mechanisms of subjugation. And so we cannot pretend, and this is where I get different, we cannot pretend that those so-called issues, whether gender, sexuality, and class, isn't part of our conversation or shouldn't be part of our conversation today, especially in regards to education. But in the same way, and I've said this before, and I'll be straight up, I know, people, especially in college, like to use words like intersectionality and all these kinds of fancy words today. And I always say, as Native peoples, we got to be careful because the so-called oppressions that may happen in Washington or may happen in DC is not many times the same ways in which our people. So in other words, we cannot quickly just take that same kind of systematic ways of oppression and somehow locate them at the center of our struggle here. And I've said this before, so it's public. I've said, because I understand, as Kalehua is also saying, within our culture, in our own cultural framework, if you really understood our cultural framework, those kinds of issues of gender and sexuality really shouldn't be part of the system of domination. But it is. You see, that's the thing. It is, and it's because we're tainted by those forces of the Euro-American empire. So there is a way to answer those kinds of questions, I think, if we have a better understanding and more conversation via our own cultural lens. Well, with that said, I always say, it's kind of funny because, and I've had this conversation with graduate students, Hawaiians, who will talk about sexuality and gender. But then I asked them what about class? How come you don't talk about class? It's kind of funny, like, so, this great oppression that's happening to those because of the sexuality, which I agree is happening. But as I say, I know way more Hawaiians that don't go to school, don't go to college, get poor healthcare, living on the beach because of class. That, when I look at it, it's not like it's all evenly, this even playing field in our domination as a people. And I think it's important that we not be afraid to have these kind of conversations where we must talk about things like class. We must talk about things like colorism that happens within the university and the private school system. We got to talk about things in regards to language that is spoken. And so, so what I guess I'm trying to say is that we got to realize within our situation, I'm talking about right today, our people are dominated and subjugated by different mechanisms. But I don't believe those mechanisms are necessarily the same kind of platforms that are coming out of the discourses that come out of from outside of Hawaii. And sometimes I think, and I'm sharing this because I talking about ex-students or others that I've had conversations with, read a book on, some kind of, and I'm going to use maybe sexuality in regards to the domination because of sexuality, which again is live and is important here in Hawaii. But when I look at the overall effects upon our people as a lahui, I can see, I mean, I look at class as being the #1 issue in regards to what is causing destruction and what is causing problems in our community. You know, there are thousands of our people that still live in blue tarps. There are many of our people who don't get healthcare, don't get dental care, don't even have a car to drive. So in other words, I think we have to be honest at the same time and understand that the mechanisms of oppression are not just kind of like equal. And we have to locate them from ourselves first and stop, again, ike kohoa kanako, kipa heva kealohe ka ʻŌlelo, and not just quickly assuming that what is the #1 issue in Seattle, for example, is the same #1 issue that we might have here as a people. And I know, I'm sharing this
Hey, you
because
talking to me or something? You keep bringing up Seattle.
yeah. No, but I think this is something that I mean, I'm not poking at the university community, but this is something I believe you can talk about the university community if you're not working with the people with the blue tarps, you see. And that's why I'm trying to get back. So that's why I say, if you are walking with the people, the homeless communities and those who are struggling every day, just to go to school, just to pay for healthcare, single moms who struggle and fight to find, you know, I guess I'm trying to say, that's where I think a lot of our people's energies should be paying more attention to, perhaps. I'm not saying not to discount those other questions, but I continuously ask, how come we're not looking at those, looking at what the masses, and again, going back to what's affecting the masses of our people. And so, you know, I think we need to pay attention to that, but it has to be part of a larger conversation where we put all of this on the table.
I like chime in real fast too. Malu, for this question, you know, when Kaleikoa brought up earlier, ho'olaka, I think the way that we've looked at our history and looked at the way that education became a project of ho'olaka, we should absolutely look at that from a gendered lens. And we can start with Kamehameha schools, because that ho'olaka, that training was totally like gendered, right? Girls, you guys gotta emulate yourselves like European women. Boys, you guys gotta emulate yourselves like this European, you know, notion of masculinity. So there's a lot of historical work to do there. When I went to, and that continues on today too, right? So when I remember when I was, when Kahele first started Punana Leo, they did this activity on one of the family nights or whatever, where they said, okay, all the men are gonna go outside and all the women are gonna stay inside. And then they asked the question, as wahine, what is our kuleana? And outside was, as kane, what is our kuleana? And there was no cultural grounding for that question. And it just became the answer according to what everybody was taught in 1870, you know, 9 at Kamehameha schools. So there's work that we need to do to like question that aspect of who we think we are also. And then lastly, I just want to say at Anuenue, there's been some moments where I'm just like, I'm so grateful as a mom. I think it was Valentine's Day this last year. And at Pico in the morning, the Po'okumu and some of the other kumukane gave a ha'i ʻŌlelo geared at the boys to kind of break down their notions of the connection between romantic love and their identity as kane. And they problematized that. And they encouraged them to lean into their friendships as kane and like these other kinds of, you know, notions of love. And when Kahele told me that, she came home and reported that ha'i ʻŌlelo, I was just like, you know, I really do want that intentional attention to gender at the kula as part of the decolonizing education. On the other hand, there's no sex ed at Anuenue. And sex ed these days includes conversations about consent, like explicit conversations and teachings about consent when it comes to sex and relationships, right? And that's a resource issue, but it's also, you know, it's also particular to how our keiki like get opportunities to think in new ways about themselves, right? That are really important. So I agree with you, Kaleikoa. I think we just blow it on class. Kathy Ferguson, she says, hey, Europe does class and they blow at race. United States, race, gender, everything but class, and blow at class. So that's also a part of our who's dominating us. It's an issue of economics, which is why we are taught to not look at class. But these other things are really important to me as a mother of a girl, and in real ways in the education system. So sorry, I had to add a little bit of that mana'o too. It's real, just kind of nitty gritty on the ground stuff. But it looks like Hiapo maybe had to run, or maybe we lost him a little bit. But I want to thank all of our panelists. And Kalehua, did you want to share anything else?
No, just wanted to let everybody know Hiapo sends his love and his apologies. His internet just went down. He's rebooting as we speak. But
Okay.
if the chance, he wanted me to give his aloha to everybody.
Right on.
I just wanted to say mahalo ilima to you for organizing this. I think it's you know, you're the glue that put it all together, and I think that's a really important role. So mahalo nui, and I look forward to the next one. I'll help you plan it.
Okay. So the next one might be in person at Kawaihona, where we do maybe sort of like, you know, what would be cool is I see people in the chat. Maybe the morning plenary, the thought plenary will be a response to this panel. We can get some other people that want to kind of respond to some of the things here. We've talked about having keynote reports, so we can actually get kind of like a lay of the land structurally. What is the teacher shortage crisis right now? How many do we have in Kaipuni? And then let's start working on stuff. Let's de-silo all of these efforts and start banging to take over. And I'm going to propose we start strategizing and planning now for the next superintendent. That's going to be my what's next.
And I just want to again mahalo ilima, whole gang, and just to say to all the so-called educators I see out there, you know, one final thought for me, which is we should question, as educators, question whether or not we are just Hawaiianizing our miseducation and assimilation. Because if that's all you're doing, you might as well just take the poison straight. You know, so, and I think that's the question for me. You know, so as educators, we should always question ourselves. Is that what we're doing? You know, when we talk about Hawaiian education, or are we actually trying to transform and trying to make true changes in regards to not quickly just being assimilated and just matriculating to the system of power as is. So anyway, mahalo.
Mahalo nui.
Ke ahui ho kako. Mahalo nui. Aloha.
Aloha.